resume. Mr. Leadham and council and hearing staff and witnesses, my sincere apologies for the delay. I spent a long session with a dentist this morning, so but at least there you get freezing.
My condolences, Mr. Commissioner. Sometimes I feel my brain's been frozen.
Thank you for telling us. I think it's advisable none of us bring applications this morning.
Mr. Commissioner, it's Leadham Initial T appearing as counsel for the Conservation Coalition. As you heard yesterday, Mr. Young, who's on the panel, is an aquatic biologist with the David Suzuki Foundation, and the David Suzuki Foundation is one of the members of the coalition for whom I act. So I will treat him as my witness and limit my questions to ones of direct examination and not lead the witness. And I'm not going to leave you out in the lurch there, Dr. Riddell, as if I could. And by all means, if I ask a question that would prompt something that you would like to say, by all means, please jump in. I want to begin by examining with you, Mr. Young, what we've now marked as Exhibit 937 in these proceedings. It's a report entitled Returning Salmon, Integrated Planning and the Wild Salmon Policy in BC. And how did this report come into being?
So we were quite closely engaged at that point with the implementation of the wild salmon policy and saw it as kind of a key strategy to improving conservation of salmon in BC. So, beyond that, we recognized that the integrated planning component of that, or the strategic planning component of that policy was a key challenge, something that we thought the department could use some support and advice around. We knew that there were some good experts out there in terms of looking at these types of questions around planning, and so we worked with Asset Technologies. I particularly worked with Mark Nellitz, and we commissioned this report to evaluate essentially some of the practical ways in which we could undertake integrated planning under the wild salmon policy.
And Dr. Riddell, in your experience, in your past experience as a DFO scientist, was it common that environmental groups and outside groups would often do this, but would retain a contractor and provide advice to the DFO in this mechanism?
Well, I think that in the last sort of 10 years, my career had become much more common. David Suzuki Foundation probably led the way, but Watershed Watch, EcoTrust, a number of groups would submit papers on particular topics at the time.
And how generally are these received by the department?
I believe thoughtfully. How much was there interaction with the sort of authors and the organizations? That varied quite a bit on the topic. This particular one that you're referring to, it got a fairly wide read. It came in as I was actually leaving, so I can't comment too much on the department. But it was really tackling an area of the coast that we saw as an omission in the department at the time, because we had a pilot program in the Fraser and Barkley Sound and the Skeena through PSF, but we didn't have a lot going on in Central Coast, although there'd been a lot of work done there. So this was actually a kind of a timely document.
Mr. Young, if I could ask you to turn to page 2 of this report under the heading Recommendations, and there's a bold section with some bullets after it. The bold section reads that the David Suzuki Foundation is asking the federal government to. Have you had an opportunity to review those recommendations?
Yes, I have.
And are they still consistent today? I note that the report was authored back in 2008.
I would say they're still consistent and perhaps slightly more urgent.
I now ask you to turn in that same document to Table 1, which begins on page 11, Mr. Lunn. And this runs on for several pages in the document. What can you describe for the Commissioner what this table represents or what it purports to show?
I think this is an attempt to break down the strategies and activities of the wild salmon policy into some practical recommendations around actually getting the work done, who to work with potentially, and some of the key activities that would need to be undertaken. So I think it was an attempt to really codify and practically identify what sort of work we needed to do and make that as reasonable and realistic as possible.
The action steps that I find in the leftmost column start with 1.1 and then 1.2. What do they correspond to something?
Yeah, I believe they correspond to the actual action steps identified in the wild salmon policy.
All right, so if I could just quickly pull up Exhibit 8, page 16, Mr. Lund, just so we can get confirmation of that. There's a Table 1 from the wild salmon policy is now being shown on your screen. So is that what you mean by the strategies and action steps that are now depicted in Table 1 of this particular Exhibit 937?
Yes, that's correct.
And I'm going to ask you, I'm not going to go through any of these chapter and verse, Mr. Commissioner. They obviously are many strategies and much information is contained in them. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on and ask you to turn to Table 2, Mr. Young, which is at page 19. And this one should be entitled Synthesis of Challenges, see Table 1, associated with implementing strategies 1, 2, and 3. What does this purport to show?
This table is attempting to identify some of the key challenges that are that were being faced with wild salmon policy implementation, categorizing them into different areas, decision-making authority, state of knowledge, and so on. As a means to really try to break down where some of the key barriers were to implementing the policy, as a way to encourage and try to evaluate options for overcoming them.
I'm just going to reflect on two of these. The first one refers to decision-making authority, and it begins by saying, working with other government agencies, NGOs, First Nations, and communities will be essential for successful WSP implementation. How essential is that in your view?
It's absolutely essential. I think, as we've heard throughout the Commission, the role of the province is quite significant, particularly around habitat. As also identified in Strategy 4 under the policy, through integrated planning, working with different communities and First Nations and NGOs is a key element of implementing the policy. So identifying and working through those relationships is a key requirement.
The authors of this go on to say WSP was not developed in partnership with any of these groups. I'm just going to stop there. Although there wasn't any partnership, was there consultation with some of the groups in the making of the WSP?
Actually, I'd ask Brian to see if he has a perspective on that.
Well, this was a line that stuck out to me in reviewing the document. It's true that there weren't formal partnerships. I would say, though, that the department at the time did make sincere efforts to be in consultation with many groups as possible. Various groups made various efforts. Unfortunately, we didn't all have equally good consultation in all areas of the coast. But it is true, the statement, if you refer to partnerships, I think that there was certainly a serious effort to involve people through consultation.
It goes on to say there are no formal agreements to jointly implement the WSP. Would it be helpful to have joint agreements between Department of Fisheries and Oceans and some of the stakeholders to have a joint implementation of a WSP? Would that help to further the process along? Either one of you.
I can start. I referred to this yesterday, basically, that some of the efforts now are working with the department as members of working teams, but there is certainly involvement of more groups outside of DFO specifically now. So I would say yes, that we can use other people's expertise and availability and effort.
I'll just add to that quickly. Just to emphasize, so I agree. I would just emphasize too that particularly the relationship with the province is quite critical, and I think further work could probably be done there in terms of clearer collaboration on wild salmon policy implementation. I'd also like to just mention quickly around decision-making authority, although it's not specifically referenced in this part of the table. My view is that some of the, looking at challenges within the implementation of the policy, that some decision-making authority and integration of the wild salmon policy within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is quite critical and a key challenge as well, and it is reflected in other parts of this document.
And the last part of this table that I wanted to reflect on, or get your reflections on, is the on the next page, on page 20, under the heading Communication and Awareness. I find these words: there has been more outreach regarding the WSP to outside groups than within DFO, resulting in a lack of clarity within the department about the WSP intent and content, and about how it will play out on the ground. For example, what does the policy mean for general fishing exploitation levels? I wonder if you can expand on that, Mr. Young.
I think this is partly what I was alluding to. So, for example, I think it's clear actually within the policy that ultimately the information, the outcomes from evaluating CUs and monitoring their status needs to feed in directly to the management decisions of the department, including fisheries and habitat, and that it seems we're still in a state where habitat management and fisheries management are still not fully integrating the wild salmon policy components where necessary, and that perhaps there is some challenges in terms of integrating across the department, and communication may be one of those factors contributing to that.
Did you want to add anything to that, Dr. Riddell?
Well, I don't think that, I don't fully disagree with it, but I don't really fully agree with it either, in the sense that there's definitely, in any large bureaucracy, communication is a challenge, and we definitely talked about a wild salmon policy culture, that it was a change of thinking that needed to be spread throughout the department. There were many efforts made to distribute the information and get people on side, but I don't think it's unfair to say that there are some areas and some individuals who have not bought in fully, and so I can see people believing that.
We heard a lot of evidence back in November when we met to initially discuss the wild salmon policy about how the actual drafting of the policy had bogged down, and it needed someone like Pat Shamboot to actually come in and to take the reins and to bring it home. Are we at that state now where we really do need a champion, or need someone to actually come in to re-jumpstart the wild salmon policy?
Well, you may be at a different state. I mean, I think it's a very different argument. That what you were referring to is really in the early 2000s, when there was quite a debate about whether you're conserving fisheries or conserving fish, and there was a fundamental disagreement within the department. Now, really, we're looking at a commitment to implement and put it on the ground for even in the annual fisheries management planning. And that would a dedicated effort help? I think I said that yesterday, absolutely. A single champion, I think it's more like a small dedicated group of experts that would drive this forward, but it's still a big task in a sense, because as you just referred to in a previous question, there is the whole involvement of NGOs and First Nations. The consultation is still a very big effort, but you've got to do the technical work that you can go out and actually present to people to have a fruitful conversation.
Actually, I'll add quickly to that. I agree with Brian's point that a core group with dedicated support would be necessary to get a lot of the elements moving forward more quickly, but I still think both the idea of a champion, someone with kind of a dedicated effort just around the policy and its implementation, would be useful. But in addition to that, or at least in concert with that, ensuring that the accountability and authority to make this a priority implementation would be necessary as well. And I think at this point, at the RDG level, that would probably be where it would have to come down from.
Do you see that champion, as you described it, Mr. Young, would have to come from within the department, or would it be possible for somebody to parachute in and to seize that role?
I'm not quite sure. I think that there needs to be someone within the department taking on that role. Where they come from, I'm not sure how important that is, although clearly it would have to be someone with the the capacity and the ability to champion and lead something like this, and that would require some knowledge clearly of the issues that the wild salmon policy addresses.
And ultimately, would that person also have authority, as you mentioned yesterday back in Ottawa, to make sure that some of the decisions can actually be funded and be implemented in a timely manner?
Yeah, that's my view. I think that either this champion clearly has to have a strong level of authority and the ability to delegate that authority where necessary, or at least that the authority is somehow vested appropriately within the department to ensure that this moves forward.
I'm going to move away from this document now, Mr. Commissioner. I'm going to show Mr. Young another document. It's document number 2 in Canada's list of documents, titled An Upstream Battle, Declines in 10 Pacific Salmon Stocks and Solutions for Their Survival. Are you familiar with this report, Mr. Young?
Yes, I am.
And I'll ask you just to turn to the index, Mr. Lunn. This looks at 10 units, or they call it stocks back then, but and number 4 I note is Cultus Lake sockeye salmon. Is that obviously then one of the stocks of concern at the time of that report was the Cultus Lake sockeye salmon?
Yeah, that's correct. And I'll just indicate quickly the 10 stocks as they were chosen was not simply to say these are the 10 most at-risk stocks or the only at-risk stocks. We wanted to get a bit of a cross-section of where we're seeing some challenges for salmon across species and geographies to best undertake some case studies to understand what the common challenges were, to better understand how best to work through those.
Might this be marked as an exhibit, please, Mr. Registrar?
Exhibit number 939.
Now, my last question, or series of questions, is to you, Dr. Riddell, because we're going to be discussing implementation of the wild salmon policy in the panel that's coming up afterwards. And as I understand it, you're not going to be a member of that panel, are you?
That's my knowledge.
You say that with a smile.
Actually, it would have been a good one, I think.
I think
good
so.
members.
And I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you are here and that it is an important topic. Just to ask you just generally how you see the implementation playing out in the context of the existing structure where we have integrated fisheries management plans and integrated harvest management committees, things of that nature. And how do you see the concept of conservation units playing out in implementation of the wild salmon policy?
Well, I think there's a couple of points better than that. The conservation units are the new stocks. These are the units of geographic production of salmon that need to be at the basis of all of the integrated harvest planning discussions. And that within that, then of course you have your management goals, which will be defined by your benchmarks, and you'll have your annual monitoring programs upon which you would base your annual assessments. How does it integrate with the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee? I see that as actually only a component of implementing the policy, because next panel that you were referring to really gets to the heart of involving people that will be affected by these decisions and involving ecosystem-based management in real time. That means that there are groups, the provincial government, municipal governments and area First Nations, community groups. There are many groups that probably want to have an input into what the long-term strategic plans are for salmon in their area. Decisions made that are solely based on salmon are very likely to limit opportunities for logging or for development in the community and so on. So there are inherently other environmental conflicts. That was the intention of Strategy 4, is to have a broader discussion about what the commitment to salmon is in particular geographic areas. And so I really see the integrated harvest planning as just really addressing that it's the harvest component, and that it's critical to implementing Strategy 5, which is the annual delivery. But hopefully when we do the review of Strategy 6, or in Strategy 6, people will look at whether or not there's any willingness of people in geographic areas to take on the challenge in Strategy 4 and to unify into an advisory group that would then provide advice to government, including to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans about salmon in those areas.
I thank you for that answer and for your thoughts on it. And it comes back to something that we've heard already, that if you look at the Fraser River, it's a pretty vast geographic area that we're discussing, and the conservation units are in different parts of that geographic area. And so I like your concept that it may come down to some very localized planning in terms of the protection of the conservation unit on a very localized level. Do I have that right? Is that what you seem to be suggesting there?
Yes, and within the department we struggled with how many of these geographic areas you'd have, because they would probably require some core funding to have an effective consultation management of all the interest groups. We were thinking in one model would be along the lines of the First Nation linguistic groups, which would define about between 11 and 14 regions of British Columbia. And in the Fraser River, you might have sort of 3 fairly large geographic areas. And of course, when it's nested like that, ultimately you have to have a common voice somehow. So really, you'd have to look at how many of these you have to have people feel that they are involved and people are listening. And we were thinking very much that it would come down to maybe something in the range of 11 to 14 of these, call them a council for lack of a better name yet, to represent all the interests in those groups.
And what role would the Department of Fisheries and Oceans play in that scheme that you've been outlining to us?
They would be advisory to the council and that, and it's a bit of a circle, I'm afraid, though, because the people doing the assessments and doing the work in the habitat and so on, they would keep the people in the councils up to date in current information and current assessments. The advice coming out of the councils would then come back into the department as recommendations to, well, probably down through the minister's office and back to the regional director general, down to the fisheries managers and that. So I'm not sure it would be the perfect circle, but it's sort of like a circle.
Thank you for that. And I'll wait to ask you, Mr. Young, when you reappear in reincarnation on the next panel. Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Leedham. The next in order, Canada has no questions, which then takes us to the Salmon Farmers Association. Oh, yes, Salmon Farmers Association.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Shane Hopkins-Utter, HOPKINS-UTTER for the BC Salmon Farmers Association. I just have a few questions arising from the testimony given yesterday by Dr. Riddell. Unfortunately, I don't have the benefit of the transcript, so I'm just going to be going on the notes that I was taking down yesterday, so please forgive me if I've written anything down wrong, and feel free to correct me. I just wanted to ask you about the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation that you were talking about yesterday as one of the funders of the Pacific Salmon Foundation. That's an American foundation, isn't it?
That's correct.
And that foundation lists all the grants that they award on their website. Did you know that?
Yes, I did.
I went online last night. I wanted to actually have a look at the funding that you've received, and the website, please feel free to correct me, I just want a general estimate. The grants that they list seem to total approximately $3,700,000 between 2008 and March of this year to the Pacific Salmon Foundation. Does that number sound about right?
It could be correct. I haven't actually added it up, but it's for 3 major activities in the Skeena Basin, and it has been going for about 3 years. So I think you'd be in that range, yes.
That actually seems like quite a lot of funding.
Yes.
Is that money that was not otherwise available through the Government of Canada then?
That magnitude of money was certainly not available for one area. But maybe I should just clarify the use of those funds is really broken down into a governance allocation, and that's where we are trying to get an example of a strategy for a working group for the Skeena Basin. And that pays for people's involvement. There's a very regular set of meetings, regrettably. It has taken quite a bit of time to get people in moving forward in agreement. A large chunk of the money annually goes directly to new science programs, and that many of them targeted at the need for information on habitat quality, habitat mapping. We've had programs in looking at bycatch in fisheries to address concerns of the Upper River First Nations. We've had a number of large programs looking at Chinook assessments, DNA analysis and population estimates, and a significant sum into steelhead management. And then there's basically an administration overhead to the foundation that pays for our staff and travel time to implement those programs.
Does any of that money go towards marketing and education?
It would go to education. It does not go to marketing.
Okay. Are you aware of Gordon and Betty Moore grants to other groups that may include marketing?
Yes, I am.
And are those groups also located in British Columbia?
Some of them are, yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Yes, Don Rosenblum, I appear on behalf of Area D Gillnet, Area B Sainer. Mr. Lunn, if you'd be good enough to put Exhibit 939 back on the screen and the index page that was there previously. I understand, Mr. Young, that the 1 to 10 species as listed there are not necessarily David Suzuki Foundation's list of the most aggravated situations in terms of stock health. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I indicated how we had chosen those stocks. That's not to say that some of them might be what we'd consider the most significant stocks of concern, but that wasn't the intent of the list, was to identify the 10 most egregious declines.
But they are 10 stock that the foundation feels should be closely monitored?
I think inherently, given the situation with these stocks, yes, but I would generally say as well that one of the benefits of the wild salmon policy is that ultimately I think it's a benefit to get to a point where we have a good understanding of the status of CUs in this case across the province, including ones that are doing quite well, so that we can understand how to maintain those benefits.
When you look at this list, is it correct to say only Cultus is within the Fraser watershed? No, I'd be wrong about that, wouldn't I? Well, obviously wrong about that. How many of the 10 would be within the watershed of the Fraser?
Well, with respect to sockeye, Cultus is the only one, but the North Thompson coho, Brunette River coho are the others that would be from the Fraser watershed.
We're so single-focused at this inquiry for obvious reasons, and that relates to the terms of reference imposed upon the Commission. But can you give us a general sense whether the Cultus lake sockeye would, from your perspective, be the most advanced in terms of implementation of WSP? I want to get a sense, because I think the Commission should get a sense, whether the WSP has been primarily focused in terms of implementation within Barkley Sound and the Fraser watershed, or whether indeed what we're hearing about in respect to our focus would be applied across the board in terms of the degree of implementation anywhere else in the province.
Ultimately, that's actually a fairly complicated question. I would say that at a broad level, there's been a certain amount of progress with respect to strategies 1 and 2 and 3 in terms of getting the basic science completed that would apply to the entire, to all salmon within BC. I think that there have been some unique efforts undertaken in Cultus Lake and Barkley Sound and Skeena, for example. Probably Barkley Sound and to some extent Skeena are the closest to being identified as something that was at least partly or said to be an attempt to implement the wild salmon policy. However, they're also kind of missing some of those key first elements. I think the Cultus sockeye situation, I think that was born out of issues predating the wild salmon policy, driven a lot by the COSUIC listing. I think there's some lessons that we could learn from that process that we could definitely use to help our understanding of how to implement the wild salmon policy.
Would you say Cultus is the most implemented of the WSP program of those 10?
I struggle with really being able to say that one of these stocks or another has the most implementation of the wild salmon policy. I mean, for example, we don't have benchmarks for Cultus sockeye explicitly under the wild salmon policy, which I see as kind of a key early element of WSP implementation. So at that level, no, it's not. In terms of having taken some efforts that involve different stakeholders and evaluating information, I guess you could say that Cultus Lake may be in a better position to be able to proceed with WSP implementation.
Dr. Riddell, do you have anything to add in terms of responding to my question?
Well, I think a direct answer to your question would be that probably had the greatest focus attention has been on Cultus Lake. Is it the greatest implementation of the policy? Of those 10, I don't think there'd be any question that it has proceeded the furthest, but I would point out that there have been a number of the stock assessment review documents, including a lower benchmark, which was defined a few years ago, so that we had a lower level where we could, if we had to, we would have to shut down fisheries to avoid getting down to extremely small population sizes that would have long-term genetic impacts on the stock as well. That work was done, I think, in about 2005, and that. So there's also the habitat monitoring going on. There are issues in the lake and in the downstream area that people are paying attention to. I think you've probably heard a lot of this in the previous few days. And that, so I think Jeff is correct in the sense that it's not being managed directly on the wild salmon policy, and that, but it certainly has gone the furthest in terms of what's going to be required to implement the policy there.
Thank you. Dr. Riddell, you and I have had numerous exchanges during the life of this inquiry regarding fiscal capacity of DFO to pull off the wild salmon policy with full implementation. And you recall testimony you gave some time ago regarding more recent budgetary restrictions imposed upon the department by Treasury Board. You recall testimony you gave about the 5% reduction, and you educated us from your perspective, because it was a 5% reduction of overall budget of the department, and because salaries could not be obviously tampered with based upon collective agreements, the 5% really represented, I believe, from your testimony, approximately 15% reduction on the operational side. You remember giving that evidence?
Yes, I do.
Right. Now, what I don't believe has been elicited from you or anyone else at this inquiry, unless I missed it on a day I wasn't here, is when the department is facing down these difficult budgetary problems, and when the department is obligated by international agreement to focus on certain areas of the province because of those international obligations, it is at the expense, obviously, of other areas that are underfunded because there's a transfer of money from one program to another. Is that fair to say?
Well, it's fair to say, and I think we did have a fairly extensive discussion on material like that at one point when I was giving testimony, because the Fraser sockeye is clearly seen as the priority for management and conservation within DFO on the West Coast.
Right.
And as a program manager, there were many, many discussions with staff about, we have to fund the key program under the Pacific Salmon Treaty. There are obligations that must be met there and that. And so there are consequences to other assessment programs because there's a limited budget and that. And what that really has done over time, you tried to find money in many ways and many different agreements, and we sometimes would have things from B-based budgets where there were soft short-term allocations, or you had partnerships with other groups on a temporary basis. And so one of the things that I always tried to limit was how this made our assessment a sort of a piecemeal, because a consistent assessment throughout the province is kind of the legacy of information that you leave behind. All right, but there's no question that what you're discussing is an impact that we've dealt with for a number of years.
Where there may be a gap in the evidentiary base of this inquiry up to this point in time, and what I want to solicit from you is, what expense is there in transferring money from programs outside of the sockeye of the Fraser River and the watershed? You probably better than anybody can speak to the province-wide situation. What are some of the other critical areas in terms of requiring significant financial resources by department to sustain a healthy resource, be it with sockeye species or any other species? The point I'm really asking is, at the end of the day, should the Commission not be mindful of what are the consequences when there is a financial shortage and where government is trading monies from programs outside of the sockeye of the Fraser, and what is the prejudice to those other programs?
Well, I think you had a discussion on stock assessment prioritization and how the budget process functions. I think the best way to answer your question is sort of examples. And I think I also recall describing that the sockeye issue really depends on the year of the 4-year cycle. And so you have 1 year where you have the Adams return and you have the big summer returns. And so you have really a bad year where it costs a lot of money. I think the budget going into the Fraser varied by about twofold. And so that was basically about $1 million that you had to find from other programs outside. But the best case example is that in the early 2000s, because of limited fishing demand at the time and because there was no real perceived conservation concern, we actually stopped enumerating Fraser River pink salmon. And so in recent years where we've had extremely good returns of pink salmon in the Fraser, there's not a quantitative assessment. The second one that would take a reduction in costs is really chum coastwide. Chum has an added cost. To really understand chum, you need to do age-structured analysis. And so that has taken a back seat. Now we have a problem where there are certain areas where chum are a conservation concern and we have very limited data. After chum come coho. And so there's a
coastwide?
No, we very much would try to maintain the indicator stocks in southern BC. All of these things through time became kind of a hierarchy of what's the least impact and what needs to be required because of a number of government priorities, from the Pacific Salmon Treaty through agreements with First Nations and so on down a list. So the particular area that you're talking about, northern BC, if the stocks are particularly healthy, then the primary assessment was the Babine fence sockeye. And so now in that area where we talk about looking at benchmarks, we're looking at how you're using a fairly weak information base for a number of small sockeye stocks. So there's an effect of not having these resources through time. Really all we did at the time was try to get the best allocation we could to meet most of the priorities for the money we had.
And these stock that you mentioned, the list of, I believe, 4, are obviously stock of consequence in terms of the commercial fishery.
Many of them will be, yes.
Yes. And is it your evidence that as a result of this budgetary shortfall that those stock have suffered in terms of the fiscal attention that should be given to them?
Well, I'm not sure that I would be able to really say that. If the fisheries are managed in a conservative manner, like many pink and chum fisheries in central and northern BC are limited to around 50% harvest rate. In most cases, that's not going to be a significant impact on the stock. And until recent years with marine survival, we hadn't really seen a major problem. David Peacock, a manager in the north, was just telling me the other day, though, that we are seeing recent declines that are significantly limiting fisheries in the central coast for pink and chum. So, these things kind of come and go. But depending on the sort of level of impact historically, I don't know if you could say that across the board.
Right. Mr. Young, do you wish to have any input in response to my question? Thank you. Yesterday, you both spoke of the kind of monies that you believe are necessary to get the WSP into full implementation, if I understood your testimony correctly. Assume for a moment, Dr. Riddell, that those monies are not forthcoming. In other words, that we are going to carry on into the future, near future, with continuing budgetary restrictions, that DFO's budget will either remain neutral or will be diminished by Treasury Board over the next 4 or 5 years. Just accept that for a moment. What is the prognosis for the WSP implementation if indeed we carry on with what has been the history financially over the last 2 or 3 years with the department?
Well, I'm not sure that I can really speak for the department anymore. I'm only really knowing what you're hearing in the paper in terms of reductions. If there are further reductions in capacity, then I don't think it'd be a surprise that we'd have a slower implementation even from what we've seen. But I think that we have made enough progress in some of the implementation steps that the department would be much more willing to start working with external groups, as we've just talked about, in terms of really getting the analyses done, implementing some monitoring programs through stewardship groups, looking for sort of a more widely dispersed implementation process to put this in place. Now, I think that puts the overall process at a bit of risk in the sense that you do need to try and ensure that everything is done fairly across the board and that people are using the same standards and so on. So there is definitely an overall management responsibility that the department has to pick up if it becomes much more diversified like that.
Isn't it dangerous when government becomes dependent in part on NGOs being funded by foundations, outside foundations. Isn't there a danger when you become dependent upon that kind of relationship for what surely you would consider public interest initiatives by DFO?
Well, I've struggled with that question quite a bit in the last 2 years, and I think there's a pro and a con for it. And let me say the pro to start with is that as I'm continuing to see reductions being pressured on government and knowing the way I do what another 5 or 10% cut means to stock assessment, I've kind of changed my thinking on this in the sense that if we can find money in other ways to do short-term technical work that can be reviewed through independent peer assessment so that it's credible and people can verify it, then I think we should try and use as much money from other places as we can to deliver on these programs. Where I think we need to be very careful, though, is that the money that is left in government is directed to continue maintaining a stock assessment basis that we can depend on for doing the annual assessments. My concern now is that if you leave the responsibility solely with government, that they will have to continue to divert funds into getting more people doing work into these evaluations, and maybe we'll do less monitoring at fisheries or we'll do less enforcement. I would rather see government focus that money in having a legacy of good quality data for assessment, appropriate sort of management and monitoring of fisheries, and the other environmental impacts, and other groups could provide money to do the short-term technical assessments. I would think we've seen very good work done through the examples that you've shown by David Suzuki Foundation going out to people locally that can write reports and provide advice back to government. We can do the same thing with our local university. We have some people that the rest of the world comes to for advice. We can have people at these schools doing some of the analyses. I'm working with a graduate of UBC right now on the Skeena. So they're very good people that can address some of the issues that are limiting progress in the WSP. Yes, some of the money is likely to come maybe from the Moore Foundation or from other foundations. I don't really see that as a big threat as long as it's work that is a specific objective to be done, that it can be peer reviewed and people can discuss it and agree with whether the analysis is correct or not. Yes, I think pretty much everything that I'm aware of, although there are some Japanese foundation, I don't think there's any money here though for that.
Yes. I'd like to just deal with one other brief area of focus. We've talked about enhancement programs, the hatchery programs, and I believe both of you spoke yesterday, or one of you did, about some issues, and I just want to explore them briefly. You're a geneticist by background, are you not, Dr. Riddell?
Yes.
Do you have concern as to the degree of the percentage of stock that is a hatchery-based stock as opposed to wild stock?
Percentage of stocks? No, I don't have a particular concern on that. I have concerns in particular areas, but in terms of the big picture, in terms of the number of populations in British Columbia that have extensive enhancement on them, it's not a very large percentage of the total population at all.
Do you have any idea just off the top of your head about what percentage of, for example, sockeye of our coast is enhanced?
Well, see, the sockeye number in the north is going to be large because you'd have to determine how much of the Babine development program you want to count as enhanced. Enhanced there is the spawning channels. A substantial number of the smolts coming out of Babine Lake, probably 50% plus, are from the spawning channels. And then put that in the context of the total Skeena. So I think when they actually look at returns, it could easily be 50 to 60% of the Skeena sockeye return are from spawning channels. But now spawning channels are not ones that people really focus a lot of attention genetically, because you do allow mate selection to proceed in the artificial rivers that you built.
Yes.
They're not the hatchery analogy.
And what about the South Coast?
South Coast, you get small numbers in the Fraser, probably under 5%. It may vary in a particularly low year. So if you have the low cycle 4 year and then you had a good weaver return, you could find that your population numbers could come up to 10 to 20%, I would think. The bigger numbers, though, are things like coho salmon, where you have very large hatchery programs in the past. We have had years where coho catch in the Strait of Georgia has been 50 to 60% from the local hatcheries in the lower Fraser and around the Strait of Georgia. So it varies by area and species.
And am I correct that there is no real scientific work done on the resilience of the hatchery fish as opposed to the wild fish in terms of their cycle and their return and recruits per spawner?
No, I don't think so. We do have wild stock monitoring for coho, and we do have hatchery monitoring. You do find that the hatchery fish are surviving less than the wild fish, so that's an element of resilience. There is a number of programs, particularly very intensive studies in recent years, mostly in the Northwest states, that hatchery fish are surviving more poorly than wild, and their genetic fitness is less. But if you're talking about sockeye salmon, there's very little work that's been done on that. It's largely been work done on coho salmon and steelhead and some Chinook.
And my last question is, as a geneticist, does that concern you that there is so little knowledge of the disparity in health, so that's not a good term, the difference in survival of the hatchery fish as opposed to the wild fish? Is this a matter that should concern us?
Well, since it's my particular bias, I'd have to say yes. But really, in terms of the big picture, I don't think there's any question that we needed to do more in understanding the effect of the hatcheries through time. I think people have come to an awareness now that you really have to be cautious about what the major hatcheries are doing. For example, ask yourself a simple question that we continue to limit fisheries in the Strait of Georgia, but we still have full output of coho smolts from our major hatcheries. All right, what is causing that? Is that really cost effective to continue those programs like that, or should we put that money into restoration of natural habitats?
Thank you. Any comment, Mr. Young?
I generally agree with what Brian said. I just wanted to add one element around sockeye in the Fraser, and that's that looking at it not as a total amount of sockeye, but as separate CUs. Clearly, we've heard a bit about how cultus sockeye itself has been enhanced, and I do have some concerns about how that may develop, although I do think they're looking fairly closely at some of those genetic issues, and I hope we do learn as much as we can about how we're using enhancement in cultus as a means to deal with issues there, as well as understanding how we're going to approach enhancement moving forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Harvey.
Representing the Area G Trollers and the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. I'm going to be taking the advantage of your presence here, Dr. Riddle, to clarify some things that arose out of your earlier testimony. On December 1st, you gave evidence, and perhaps Mr. Lund could get the transcript ready in case we have to refer to it. December 1st transcript. Page 64, I had asked you some questions about the major contribution of the wild salmon policy. And you mentioned early on the establishment of 2 benchmarks, not just one. And you mentioned that a bit later in the transcript as well. That implies to me that you place some importance on the establishment of not just a lower benchmark, which we've heard a lot about, but the upper benchmark. Is that correct?
Yes, but the context of my comment would have been actually opposite of that, because we always had a target escapement goal, which was defined by the spawners providing the maximum sustained yield, and that would actually be the target reference point. We never had a specified lower benchmark for any salmon stocks. That was the significant addition in the policy.
Yes. Is the wild salmon policy, though, not meant to have 2 benchmarks in the sense of one that it's undesirable to go below and another that it's undesirable to go above?
I mean, the undesirable above is not as critical as the lower, but yes, you could state it that way.
Perhaps not as undesirable, but it is undesirable in 2 senses, is it not? That it of course impacts on the harvests and the users, whether commercial, aboriginal, or sports. And also, if it gets to such a level, it will impact on the ecosystem that the sockeye fry rely on for their survival during their freshwater stage, correct?
Well, I think in that same day we were discussing about how far above, and I think that the consensus from a number of people seemed to be about 2 times the target reference point. So that's substantially above. And that, so, I mean, I don't disagree with the way you're stating it in the sense that, yes, it's less desirable to be far above the target because you clearly are taking away from other opportunities of use and that. But all I was trying to say there is how critical it is to be, you know, what's the impact of going far above? Well, far above is quite a ways above. A little bit above, I mean, the target for management might be plus or minus 25% would be how a manager might think about trying to achieve that target. So if you got to 125% of goal, that's not going to be anything comparable to the risk of going below the limit reference point.
No, but it is going to begin to present a risk, provided the scientific basis for the benchmark is correct. It may present a risk to the ecosystem that supports the sockeye during their freshwater phase.
Not if it's within about 100%. As I said, it's about people that are talking about it, and I think you're referring to the Alaskan paper that referred to this as well, yes. and people looking at, well, where is over-spawning was the topic. Yes. Where is this really becoming a problem or could have a significant effect? And they're thinking twice the MSY value. Right. We have had examples, however, where it's been well above twice recently. Yes. And clearly that's what generates many of these concerns.
Yes, all right. Yes, and I'm going to ask you something about that. But at page 78, if we could look at that, Mr. Lund, December 1st transcript, page 78. I asked you a question about the upper benchmark, and this is, well, I suppose just to get the full passage of it, I'll start at page 77, towards line 32. Said, what I'm leading up to, and I'll get to it, is there anything in the wild salmon policy that would assist if it turns out that we've been putting, in recent years, too many fish in the spawning grounds and we've been oversupplying the spawning grounds, leading to weakened smolts, increased disease, a depletion of food resource in the lakes, and an increase in predators feeding on the vast number of fry. Is there anything in the wild salmon policy which, if that is the cause of a loss of productivity and a declining return, if that is the cause of it, is there anything in the wild salmon policy that addresses it? And you said, yes, the wild salmon policy requires 2 benchmarks.
Mr. Commissioner, I hesitate to interrupt, but I'm not sure of the utility here of putting a question and answer that has already been put by this questioner to this witness before.
All right. Well, I was just trying to establish the context. But at any rate, at page 78, when you're asked about the upper benchmarks, you referred to a paper, and you said, this is at line 17, and the benchmarks may not be any different at all. That's from the historic benchmarks. That is yet to be determined, and that is the paper that one of you referred to as 194 pages long and was just being reviewed now. And was just being reviewed now, I would expect that when it comes through that you will see changes to the upper benchmarks. Now, that paper, I wasn't able to see that it was identified in connection with this, so I'd like Mr. Lund to pull up exhibit, was it 182? 184. And this is, Mr. Lund, is this 194 pages long?
It is.
All right.
See, that's good, eh?
Yes. Dr. Riddle, is this the paper that you were referring to?
Yes, it is.
All right. Now, in this paper, I'd just like to make reference to a few things to see whether this is what you had in mind. First of all, page 12. Page 12, I'm sorry. Oh, yes, page 12 has these 2 graphs, one showing productivity declining, one showing effective total spawners increasing, more or less mirroring one another. And I think you said last time that may be a coincidence. It is either cause and effect or coincidence or a combination of the two, I suppose. Would you say that, or can you say anything more precise?
Well, the reason I put it in those terms is that there have been a number of management actions taken for particular stocks of concern. You spent time talking about cultus in particular. One of the things that you're looking at in effect of total spawners in the mid-90s on is a significant increase because we have limited fisheries to allow increased escapements to protect weaker populations, and that has in some cases resulted in large escapements to a couple of stocks, notably to Quesnel and to the Adams in 2 cycles.
Yes. And the intent of the wild salmon policy is to somehow balance things in the socioeconomic analysis and also in the ecosystem-based management analysis, to do a balancing. Is that basically, that's correct, isn't it?
Well, it's correct in intent, but I don't try to use balance much anymore because it's either sort of on or off in people's minds. What is really missing in the discussion of wild salmon policy is the strategy 4 should be a fuller discussion than just simply talking about balance. I mean,
yes.
You can talk when you have the CUs defined. What is the state of the CU? Does it limit fishing in particular times? What are your opportunities to restore the productivity of that CU? It doesn't have to mean that fisheries have to be shut down immediately because something is in the red zone.
No.
But we have to get to the point of having the CUs defined, the status assessed, and having a process to have that dialogue.
Yeah.
And that is why I referred earlier. I think your conversation the next few days will be important with Strategy 4.
Yes. But the intent of the policy, though, is to get to the stage where that dialogue can take place in an informed basis, informed by socioeconomic data, but informed also by ecosystem data, including the risk of declining productivity, which results from large escapements.
Very
Correct?
large, yes.
Yes.
In dealing with the Skeena work that we're just talking about, we've had an interesting discussion that, oh, maybe I'm wrong. I thought you had right above it, there was the red, amber, green. To address what you're talking about, it's quite possible that above the green you have another amber. And that, which really addresses what you're referring to. At some point in time, it's of less value to put those fish on the spawning grounds. There's no question about that.
Yes, but I'm going to come to the terms of the wild salmon policy in a moment, but generally, the wild salmon policy is very weak on that score, isn't it? It doesn't ever identify what you just mentioned, that there might be an amber zone above the green. It doesn't ever identify the detrimental effects of exceeding the upper benchmark.
Well, that's true, but the reason for that is when you really look at reference points around the world, many people refer to the upper as the management target. And the reason for doing that is where there should be a more fulsome dialogue about, you know, what are the objectives within a particular management scenario.
Yes.
And it's those objectives that you're referring to, the biological, the social, and the economic.
Yes. Now, the biological objective is meant to take into account the carrying capacity of the freshwater system. Is that correct?
Yes.
And there's a discussion in this paper at page 32 on that. Mr. Lund could turn us to that. There's a carrying capacity discussion that goes on for several pages. The second page has a graph of the carrying capacity of various lakes. For example, if we look in the green section, the Quesnel system average has got a 1 million spawner carrying capacity, Shuswap 1.5, etc. Is this part of the information that you had in mind when you said that when this paper is published and analyzed, you expected it would lead to changes in upper benchmarks?
That would be part of the data that would be considered in defining the upper benchmark.
All right. Also, I think just if we could turn to page 155. There's another graph, more or less the same, somewhat more more refined, I think, with all these various numbers. And again, Quesnel is in the 1 million range and Shuswap in the 1.8 or 1.7 million range. That compares, well, I guess I don't have to go through the record with you. But this paper, I've read it, and I've read these analyses. They're somewhat complex, fair to say.
That's why you need the dialogue.
Yes, but you can't have dialogue with members of the public on a subject like that, can you? That may be a good subject for scientific dialogue, but if you expect these matters to be resolved on a consensus basis with non-scientifically trained members of the public, you're not going to get a very good answer, are you?
I wouldn't agree with that, actually. My experience, and this has been in a number of very public and open forums and through the Pacific Salmon Treaty work as well, probably some of the most complicated analyses done on the entire coast is with Chinook salmon and the coastwide Chinook model.
Yes.
And you can make substantial progress if you take the time to build it from A to Z,
Yes.
so people understand the logic.
Yes.
And really what you want to do with all this information is look at the consequence of actually using any of these particular benchmarks.
Yes.
And that's where the trade-off analyses that Dr. Walters refers to at times, where you can actually look at what are the consequences of a range of target escapement goals and that. And I think it's by going through that dialogue, well, people will see that, you know, a few 100,000 sockeye here in terms of the upper benchmark or the target reference point, it actually doesn't have a great deal of effect in the future projection. It can have a very big effect when you're talking about the lower benchmark.
Yes.
And so you can do things to show people how these analyses are conducted and what the trade-offs mean to them in real numbers and fish.
Well, we've had some other evidence since you were last here. Dr. Peterman gave evidence. Now, every time I refer to it, Mr. Timberg stands up and objects. So he's not here to object. So this time I'd like to put the page number so that there's no doubt about what Dr. Peterman did say. And it's April 20th, page 95. This follows a discussion about a paper, I think it was entitled something like, "Does Overescapement Cause Stock Collapse?" And if we could start reading just about halfway down the final paragraph that's quoted there from a previous report, said the panel's opinion about the effect of delayed density dependence on the long-term decline of Fraser sockeye productivity ranged from likely to possible to unlikely as a contributing factor. Could I ask you where you stand on that continuum? Dr. Peterman says, where do I stand on that continuum? Well, it depends on the stock. I guess our analyses that I reported on this morning would suggest that a delayed density dependence has played a role in the Quesnel for the long-term decline in productivity. But we have not seen evidence of that in other Fraser stocks. Question, so I think I haven't got it in front of me, but I think one of the mandates of this commission is to find as a fact the reasons for the 2009 failure. I'm paraphrasing. You would support as a finding of fact that the high escapement levels in the Quesnel led to the substantial and serious declines of the Quesnel 2009 return. I'm afraid I can't speak specifically to 2009. All right, at any rate, do you say that delayed density dependence is a likely cause contributing to the long-term decline of the Quesnel run? In the Bridget Dorner-Peterman report, well, I thought that's what you said a minute ago, it says yes. And that's one of the passages. But that...
Excuse me, Mr. Commissioner, just to note that Mr. Harvey has run the clock out.
Well, perhaps this is a good time for a break because I'm not finished and Mr. Eidesvik goes next. Perhaps I could cut into some of his time if he consents.
Okay.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes. Chris?